border, begging for sanctuary. But the tragedy of the last German emperor did not begin in the trenches of the Western Front. It began 60 years earlier, when an infant was dragged from his mother's womb with a crushed, withered left arm. That child would spend his entire life trying to mask his physical defect with glittering uniforms, bombastic threats, and a blind, toxic jealousy of his British relatives. It was a life built on thin-skinned narcissism and an erratic temper that ultimately dragged the world into hell. He built a shell of iron to hide a broken man, only to end his days stripping away that armor, left as nothing more than a lonely old man chopping wood in exile, while the 500-year legacy of the Hohenzollern dynasty crumbled into ash. On January 27, 1859, in Berlin, the highly anticipated birth of the Prussian heir turned into a physical tragedy from the very first breath. In a desperate bid to save both mother and child from a difficult labor, doctors used brute force to extract the infant, leaving Prince Wilhelm with a permanently damaged and withered left arm. For the Hohenzollern dynasty, which worshipped military might and required a king to be a supreme warlord capable of sitting tall in the saddle and drawing a sword, this defect was not merely a medical issue, but a symbolic catastrophe for the entire nation. This physical reality collided violently with the perfectionist expectations of his mother, Princess Victoria, who viewed her son not with pity, but with shame and disappointment. Wilhelm's childhood became a torture chamber, disguised as medical treatment, from thrusting his arm into the warm carcasses of slaughtered hares, to enduring painful electric shocks and being clamped into metal head-stretching machines for hours. Through these horrific experiences, Wilhelm learned the cruel lesson that his body was an enemy to be conquered, and that his mother's love was not unconditional, but a reward reserved only for appearing normal. The harshest crucible, which truly forged the Kaiser's character, was his riding lessons. Unable to balance with his paralyzed arm, the young Wilhelm was thrown from his pony hundreds of times, enduring pain, mud, and tears under the cold supervision of a tutor who forbade any assistance. Yet, instead of breaking, Wilhelm rose with an iron will, forcing his broken body to submit. His victory in the saddle ingrained a dangerous ideology that would later haunt Europe, that weakness was death, and that aggression and the display of absolute strength were the only paths to survival. As he grew, Wilhelm constructed a loud, brash shell to hide the insecure child within. He became a master at concealing his withered arm and gradually rejected the liberal values of his parents, gravitating instead toward the Prussian military cult, where he found the adoration and flattery he starved for. Wilhelm loved uniforms because they made him feel whole, but behind the arrogant facade lay a fragile soul and a contradictory personality. He worshipped his grandmother's England, yet yearned to defeat it to force their respect, a toxic love affair armed with a dagger. The year was 1877. The air in Bonn, a university town on the banks of the Rhine, was thick with the smoke of student pipes and the sound of clinking beer steins. Here, amidst the lecture halls and the rowing clubs, the 19-year-old Prince Wilhelm was supposed to be learning how to be a modern constitutional monarch. It was the dream of his parents, a civilian education for a civilized king. But dreams in the Hohenzollern family had a habit of dying young. While his tutors droned on about law, philosophy, and history, Wilhelm's mind was elsewhere. He was physically present in the classroom, but his soul was already marching in lockstep on the parade grounds of Potsdam. He found the company of intellectuals tedious. They asked questions, they debated, they saw the world in shades of gray. Wilhelm hated gray. He wanted the stark black and white of the Prussian flag. He wanted the clarity of a command given and an order obeyed. He spent his time in Bonn not with the poets, but with the Borussia Corps, a fraternity of aristocrats who wore white caps, dueled with swords to earn facial scars as badges of honor, and drank until dawn. Here, Wilhelm was in his element. He was the center of attention. He was the future. No one mentioned the arm. No one challenged his opinions. He learned that if he spoke loud enough and if he bought enough champagne, he was the most popular man in the room. It was a dangerous lesson for a future emperor, that popularity was the same thing as loyalty. But the real corruption of his character didn't happen in the beer halls of Bonn. It happened in the officers' mess of the First Foot Guards. As he entered his 20s, Wilhelm began his military service. This was the world he had craved since he was a crippled boy watching from the nursery window. The officer corps was a hermetically sealed society, a state within a state. It was dominated by men like Count Alfred von Waldersee, ambitious, anti-Semitic, and deeply reactionary generals who viewed democracy as a disease and the parliament as a circus of fools. They saw the young prince as clay to be molded. They saw his vanity, his insecurity, and his desperate need for a father figure who wasn't a liberal like his own dad. They poured poison into his ears. They told him that his father, the Crown Prince Frederick, was weak. They told him that his mother, the English princess, was a foreign spy working against Germany's interests. They told him that he, Wilhelm, was the only hope for the fatherland. Wilhelm drank it in. He began to view his own parents not just as annoyances, but as political enemies. The dinner table at the palace became a battlefield. Wilhelm would sit there, in his uniform, ostentatiously ignoring his mother's comments, sneering at his father's liberal friends. He was rude, arrogant, and cruel. He was acting out the rebellion of a teenager, but he was doing it with the backing of the most powerful army in Europe. And then the tragedy that had been looming over the family finally struck. It started with a hoarseness in his father's voice. It was 1887. Crown Prince Frederick, a man of immense dignity who had waited decades to become emperor, began to lose his speech. The doctors looked down his throat and saw a growth. Cancer. The drama that followed was gruesome and heartbreaking. It became a proxy war between the English and German factions. Vicky, desperate to save her husband, brought in a British specialist, Sir Morrell Mackenzie. The German doctors wanted to operate immediately. Mackenzie argued it was benign. The indecision cost Frederick his voice and eventually his life. Wilhelm's reaction to his father's dying days was chilling. Instead of grief, he showed impatience. He was almost 30 years old. He was tired of waiting. He began to treat his dying father as an inconvenience. He wrote to a friend that the doctors should just put a tube in his throat and be done with it. He ordered the palace guards to report to him, not his parents. He was measuring the curtains while the king was still breathing. On March 9, 1888, the old grandfather, Kaiser Wilhelm I, finally died at the age of 90. Frederick III became emperor, but he was a ghost. He was terminally ill, unable to speak, writing his commands on slips of paper with a trembling hand. He reigned for only 99 days. Those 99 days were a silent vigil for Germany that might have been. Frederick was a man who wanted peace, who wanted to work with Britain, who wanted to liberalize the Constitution, but he was dying by inches. And pacing in the hallway, checking his pocket watch, was his son. On June 15, 1888, the end came. Frederick III died. The moment the breath left his father's body, Wilhelm II did not weep. He acted. His first order as Kaiser was not a proclamation to the people or a message of condolence to his mother. It was a military order. He ordered a cordon of soldiers to surround the new palace. No one was allowed to leave. No letters were allowed to be sent out. He was terrified that his mother would smuggle state secrets to England. He had his own mother placed under virtual house arrest, while her husband's body was still warm. He ordered troops to ransack her desk, looking for evidence of treason. It was a brutal, paranoid start to a reign. The year of 3 emperors had ended. The liberal dream was dead. The young eagle had landed on the throne and his talons were out. Wilhelm II was now Kaiser. He was 29 years old. He was the supreme warlord of the greatest military power on the continent. And standing in his way was the greatest statesman of the 19th century, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was 73. He was the Iron Chancellor, the man who had stitched Germany together out of blood and disparate states. He was a giant of history, a man of immense belly, immense appetite, and immense intellect. He had juggled the map of Europe for decades like a circus performer. To him, Wilhelm was just a boy, a volatile, inexperienced boy who needed to be managed, just as he had managed Wilhelm's grandfather. Bismarck thought he could control the new Kaiser. He was wrong. The conflict between them was inevitable. It was the clash of 2 massive egos, but also a clash of generations. Bismarck was a man of the old world, a conservative who believed in the Tsar of Russia and the divine order. Wilhelm was a man of the new age. He wanted to be a people's emperor. He wanted to address the grievances of the striking coal miners in the Ruhr, not because he was a socialist, he hated socialists, but because he wanted the workers to love him. He wanted to be the father of the nation. Bismarck wanted to crush the strikers with the army. Wilhelm refused. "I do not wish to stain my reign with the blood of my subjects," he declared. It sounded noble, but it was really about vanity. He didn't want to be unpopular. The tension in Berlin became suffocating. The cabinet meetings were excruciating. Bismarck would speak, used to absolute obedience. Wilhelm would interrupt, tapping his fingers, contradicting the old man, flaunting his ignorance as if it were insight. The Kaiser began to hold secret meetings with Bismarck's ministers, undermining the Chancellor's authority. He wanted the glory of ruling, but he had no patience for the boring work of governing. The breaking point came in early 1890. The issue was Russia. Bismarck had spent his life keeping France and Russia apart, ensuring Germany would never fight a 2-front war. He had a secret reinsurance treaty with the Tsar. It was the cornerstone of German security. Wilhelm didn't care about treaties he couldn't understand. He cared about style. He thought the treaty was too complicated. He wanted a free hand. He wanted to be friends with everyone without being tied down. He listened to the generals who told him that war with Russia was inevitable anyway, so why bother with treaties? One morning, the Kaiser arrived at the Chancellor's residence unannounced. He burst into Bismarck's bedroom early in the morning. The old man scrambled to get dressed. Wilhelm raged about a meeting Bismarck had held with a political rival. The argument grew heated. Bismarck, for the first time in his life, was being dressed down by a boy who hadn't even been born when Bismarck was already fighting wars. The Chancellor threw down his papers. He threatened to resign. It was a bluff he had used a dozen times with the old Kaiser. It always worked. The old Kaiser would panic and beg him to stay. Wilhelm didn't panic. He stared at the old man with cold blue eyes. "I accept your resignation," he effectively said. On March 18, 1890, the unthinkable happened. Bismarck was forced out. The scene of his departure was Shakespearean. The old giant, broken and bitter, packed his bags. He went to the royal crypt to say goodbye to the tomb of Wilhelm I, the master he had served for a lifetime. He left the chancellery amidst a crowd of cheering Berliners who, foolishly, thought the old man was a dinosaur, holding Germany back. They didn't realize he was the only adult in the room. Punch magazine in London published one of the most famous political cartoons in history, Dropping the Pilot. It showed the young Kaiser, wearing a crown, leaning casually over the rail of a ship, watching the old pilot, Bismarck, descending the ladder to a small boat. The ship was the German Empire. The pilot knew the shoals and the rocks. The new captain had never sailed these waters before. Wilhelm was ecstatic. "The course remains the same," he shouted to his generals. "Full steam ahead." He wrote to a friend, "I feel as playful as a puppy." He had no idea what he had done. He had removed the safety brakes from the locomotive of Europe. He had severed the wire to Russia. He had alienated the one man who knew how to keep the peace. Now, Wilhelm was truly alone. He was the absolute ruler. The spotlight was entirely on him. And the first thing he did was look toward the sea. He looked across the channel at his grandmother's fleet. He saw the gray steel of the Royal Navy battleships dominating the horizon. And a dangerous thought began to take root in his mind, a thought that would consume the treasury of Germany and poison the 20th century. "I need a fleet," he whispered to himself. "I need a hammer." The era of cautious diplomacy was over. The era of Weltpolitik, world policy, was about to begin. The Kaiser was going to step onto the world stage, and he was going to make sure that everyone, absolutely everyone, was watching him. With the steady hand of Bismarck gone, the ship of state was now careening toward open waters, steered only by the Kaiser's volatile moods. But Wilhelm didn't just want to sail, he wanted to dominate. His gaze turned obsessively toward the gray horizon of the North Sea, where the object of his greatest love and his deepest hate lay waiting. He had secured his power at home. Now he needed a weapon to force his family across the channel to respect him. The 1890s and the early 1900s were the Wilhelmina era. On the surface, it was a golden age. Germany was booming. Its factories were producing more steel than Britain. Its scientists were winning Nobel Prizes. Its cities were electric with modern energy. Berlin was becoming a metropolis to rival London and Paris. But at the top of this glistening machine sat a man who was governing by mood swing. Wilhelm didn't really rule in the traditional sense. He didn't have the patience for paperwork. He hated reading long reports. He treated the business of state like a hobby he could pick up and put down whenever it bored him. He became known as the Reisekaiser, the traveling emperor. He was always on the move, restless, terrified of boredom. He spent months every year on his royal yacht, the Hohenzollern, cruising the fjords of Norway or the Mediterranean, surrounded by a court of sycophants who told him he was a genius. This court, the Camarilla, was a bubble of unreality. They shielded him from bad news. When the Kaiser told a joke, everyone laughed. When he gave an opinion on art, the museums were reorganized. When he designed a uniform, and he loved designing uniforms, the army had to wear it. He was living in a hall of mirrors where every reflection showed him a giant. His deep-seated insecurity manifested most visibly in his wardrobe. Wilhelm possessed hundreds of uniforms and would change his outfit 5 or 6 times a day. He dressed as an admiral for breakfast, a hussar for lunch, and a British field marshal for tea. He believed that if he looked like a warrior, the world would believe he was one. But with his waxed, upturned mustache and operatic costumes, he often looked less like a king and more like an actor desperately trying to hold the center stage. But there was one place where he felt small, and that place was across the English Channel. The relationship between Wilhelm II and Great Britain is perhaps the most dysfunctional family romance in history. It was a toxic cocktail of love, hate, envy, and desperate need. Wilhelm worshipped his grandmother, Queen Victoria. He loved the English country houses, the tea, the yachting at Cowes. He wanted to be an English gentleman, but he also wanted to be the German warlord. He wanted the British to accept him as one of their own, but he also wanted to frighten them into respecting him. Every summer he would sail his yacht to the Isle of Wight for the Cowes Regatta. It was a sporting event, but for Wilhelm, it was a contest of virility. He would race his yacht, the Meteor, against his uncle, the future King Edward VII. When Wilhelm won, he gloated. When he lost, he sulked and claimed the British had cheated on the handicap. He looked at the harbor at Spithead, filled with the massive gray hulls of the Royal Navy, the force that allowed a small island to rule a quarter of the globe, and he felt a deep, gnawing inadequacy. He looked at his own withered arm, and then he looked at the British battleships, and in his mind, the two things became connected. The Navy was strength. The Navy was wholeness. If Germany had a Navy, the British would have to listen to him. They would have to treat him as an equal. In 1897, he found the man who would turn this neurosis into steel, Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. Tirpitz was a man with a forked beard and a cold, calculating mind. He understood the Kaiser's psychology perfectly. He pitched a plan to Wilhelm that was music to his ears, the risk theory. Germany would build a battle fleet so large that the British Navy would not dare attack it. It didn't have to be bigger than Britain's, just big enough to threaten their survival. This would force Britain to the negotiating table. They would have to make space for Germany. They would have to be friends. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Tirpitz and Wilhelm thought they were building a tool for diplomacy. In reality, they were building a threat that would force Britain to abandon a century of isolation. The hammers began to ring in the shipyards of Hamburg and Kiel. The high seas fleet began to rise. And in London, the alarm bells started ringing. The British didn't see a potential friend. They saw a predator holding a knife to their throat. As the ships rose, Wilhelm's rhetoric became more unhinged. He seemed incapable of keeping his mouth shut. He viewed himself as a great orator, but his speeches were impulsive outbursts that terrified his ministers. In 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion in China, German diplomats were killed. Wilhelm, enraged, addressed the German expeditionary force departing for Beijing. On the docks of Bremerhaven, he got carried away by the moment. He told his soldiers, just as 1,000 years ago, the Huns under King Attila made a name for themselves, so may the name of Germany be known in China, such that no Chinese will ever again dare to look askance at a German. It was the Hun speech. In one angry afternoon, the Kaiser had branded his own people as barbarians. It was a propaganda gift that his enemies would use for decades. During World War I, the British posters screaming, "The Huns are coming," were not invented by British propaganda. They were quoting the Kaiser himself. But the person who really got under Wilhelm's skin was his uncle. In 1901, the old Queen Victoria died. Wilhelm actually held her in his arms as she took her last breath, a moment of genuine tenderness that briefly united the families. But with her death, the throne passed to her son, Edward VII. Wilhelm despised Edward. He called him the arch-intriguer, the old peacock, and Satan. Edward was everything Wilhelm was not. Edward was fat, hedonistic, and lazy, but he was effortlessly charming. He was a master of diplomacy who could win over a room with a cigar and a smile. Wilhelm, with all his bluster and uniforms, made people nervous. Edward made people feel at ease. Wilhelm watched with mounting paranoia as his fat uncle traveled around Europe, charming the French, charming the Russians. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale. It wasn't a military alliance yet, but it was a friendship. Then, in 1907, Britain signed an agreement with Russia. The nightmare of Bismarck had come true. Germany was being encircled. To the west, France; to the east, Russia; and at sea, Britain. Wilhelm didn't see this as the result of his own aggressive navy and loud threats. He saw it as a conspiracy. He believed his uncle Edward was personally weaving a web to strangle Germany out of pure spite. "He is a devil," Wilhelm would scream at his dinner guests. "He wants to destroy me." Desperate to break this ring of iron, Wilhelm tried to reach out to the British people directly. He wanted to explain himself. He wanted to say, "Look, I am not your enemy. I love England. Why don't you love me?" The result was the Daily Telegraph affair of 1908. It was the greatest public relations disaster of his life. An English colonel who had befriended the Kaiser suggested publishing a frank interview to clear the air. Wilhelm, flattered, agreed. He rambled for hours, pouring his heart out. He sent the transcript to his chancellor, Bernhard von Bülow, for review. Bülow, lazy and overworked, didn't read it properly and sent it back. The interview was published in the Daily Telegraph. It was a bombshell. In the article, Wilhelm called the British mad as March hares. He claimed that while he loved Britain, the rest of the German people hated them. He claimed he had personally won the Boer War for Britain with his own battle plans. He claimed he was the only friend England had in a hostile world. He thought the British would be touched by his honesty. Instead, they were insulted. They laughed at him. They called him unstable. But the reaction in Germany was even worse. The German people were furious. They felt humiliated. The Reichstag, parliament, exploded in anger. For the first time, there were open calls for the Kaiser to abdicate. Wilhelm collapsed. The man of iron, the supreme warlord, fell into a deep suicidal depression. He retreated to his bed, weeping, refusing to eat. He told his entourage that he was a failure, that he should just end it all. It was a glimpse of the fragile child beneath the armor. He was terrified that he had lost the love of his people. He eventually recovered, but something had changed. He was weaker now. His confidence was shaken, and waiting in the wings were the generals, men like Helmuth von Moltke, the younger, and the dark, brooding figure of Erich Ludendorff. They looked at the Kaiser's hysterics and decided that if war came, they couldn't trust this emotional weather vane to lead them. They would have to take charge. The tragedy of the Daily Telegraph affair was that it pushed Wilhelm further into the arms of the military. To regain his prestige, to prove he was still strong, he stopped talking about friendship and started listening to the men with the maps. By 1910, the pieces were set. The uncle, Edward VII, died. Wilhelm attended the funeral in London, riding a white horse behind the coffin, the supreme actor in a pageant of death. It was the last time the royal mob would meet in peace. A new king was on the British throne, George V, Wilhelm's cousin, a quiet man who looked exactly like the Tsar of Russia. The world seemed calm. The summer of 1914 was approaching. The harvests were good. The universities were full. But underneath the soil of Europe, the fuse was already burning. Wilhelm had spent 20 years building a machine of war to satisfy his ego. He had built the ships. He had drilled the armies. He had alienated his neighbors. He had constructed a powder keg and sat on top of it, thinking his crown would keep the sparks away. The powder keg was built. The alliances were locked, and the Kaiser sat atop his throne, convinced that his sheer presence would keep the peace. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Europe settled into the languid heat of a perfect summer, thinking the danger had passed, the spark finally landed. It didn't come from a great power, but from a street corner in the Balkans, arriving just in time to interrupt a sunny afternoon on the royal yacht. June 1914. The sun was shining on the waters of the Kiel Fjord. It was the height of the summer season, and Kaiser Wilhelm II was in his element. He was wearing his admiral's uniform, standing on the deck of his golden yacht, the Hohenzollern, watching the British Royal Navy squadron sail in for a friendly visit. To an outside observer, the world looked stable. German officers and British sailors were drinking champagne together on the decks. The Kaiser was laughing, slapping British admirals on the back, talking about yacht racing. The nightmare of a European war seemed like a ghost story told by pessimists. The family, the royal mob, was at peace. But history rarely announces itself with a trumpet blast. Usually, it arrives with a whisper. On the afternoon of June 28th, a telegram arrived at the yacht. The Kaiser was busy watching a boat race. An admiral took the telegram, read it, and turned pale. He got into a launch, motored out to the Kaiser's yacht, and threw the message into a cigarette case, tossing it up to Wilhelm on the deck. Wilhelm opened the case. He read the words. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had been assassinated in Sarajevo. For Wilhelm, this wasn't just a political crisis, it was personal. Franz Ferdinand was one of the few people in Europe who actually liked Wilhelm. They were friends. They were both difficult men, both prone to rages, both obsessed with hunting and gardening. Just 2 weeks earlier, the Archduke had visited Wilhelm at his country estate. They had admired the roses together. Now his friend was dead, murdered by Serbian nationalists. Wilhelm's reaction was immediate and visceral. In his mind, this wasn't just a murder. It was an attack on the very idea of monarchy. If a royal heir could be gunned down in the street by a terrorist, then no throne was safe. The divine right of kings was under fire. The Serbs must be disposed of, and that right soon, he scribbled in the margins of a diplomatic report. His anger was genuine, but it was also dangerous. He saw this as a matter of honor, a duel between gentlemen, not a complex diplomatic puzzle involving millions of lives. On July 5, 1914, the Austrian ambassador arrived in Berlin to ask, if Austria attacks Serbia to punish them, will Germany stand by us? Wilhelm didn't consult his parliament. He didn't convene a full council of his ministers. He invited the Austrians to lunch at the new palace in Potsdam. And over lunch, in between courses, he gave the infamous blank check. He told Austria to go ahead, attack Serbia. Germany would stand behind them no matter what Russia did. Now or never, he said. He believed that Russia was not ready for war. He believed the Tsar, his cousin Nicky, would not dare defend a group of regicides who had murdered a fellow royal. He believed it would be a small, localized war, a punitive expedition that would be over in weeks. It was the greatest gamble in German history. And having cast the die, Wilhelm did something that perfectly encapsulates his chaotic leadership style. He went on vacation. On July 6th, the day after risking a world war, the Kaiser boarded his yacht and sailed for Norway for his annual summer cruise. He wanted to look calm. He wanted to signal to Europe that nothing unusual was happening. For 3 weeks, while the diplomats in Vienna and Berlin plotted the destruction of the world, the supreme warlord of Germany was cruising the fjords, lecturing his entourage on Norse mythology and doing morning aerobics on the deck. He was disconnected. He was reading limited reports. He assumed everything was going according to plan. A quick Austrian strike, a quick Serbian surrender, and a diplomatic triumph for Germany. But while he sailed, the machine of war began to turn. In Vienna, they didn't strike quickly. They waited. They drafted a humiliating ultimatum to Serbia designed to be rejected. In St. Petersburg, the Russian generals began to pressure the Tsar to mobilize. In Berlin, the German generals, Moltke and the rest, saw their chance. They didn't want a diplomatic victory. They wanted a preventive war against Russia before it became too strong. They were happy the Kaiser was away. It was easier to work without his mood swings. On July 25th, the news reached the yacht in Norway. The situation was spiraling. Austria had delivered the ultimatum. Russia was threatening war. The stock markets were crashing. Wilhelm panicked. He ordered the fleet to turn around. He steamed back to Germany at full speed. As the coast of the fatherland came into view, the supreme warlord began to realize that the game of poker he had started was no longer a game. When he arrived in Potsdam, he was shown the Serbian reply to the ultimatum. Serbia had actually agreed to almost all of Austria's demands. It was a humiliation for Serbia, but a masterstroke of compliance. Wilhelm read it and breathed a sigh of relief. A brilliant solution, he wrote. Every reason for war drops away. He ordered his chancellor to tell Vienna to stop. There was no need for war. It was a diplomatic victory. He could take credit for the peace, but it was too late. The piece of paper Wilhelm wrote on was ignored. His own chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, watered down the message. The generals ignored it. Austria declared war on Serbia anyway. The avalanche had started. It is the greatest irony of the 20th century. World War I was essentially a family quarrel gone nuclear. Wilhelm, King George V of Britain, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all first cousins. They grew up together, vacationed together, and called each other Willie, Georgie, and Nicky. But when the guns began to fire, Wilhelm didn't just see political maneuvering. He saw a personal betrayal of blood. He reportedly screamed at his generals, "George and Nicky have played me false. If my grandmother were alive, she would never have allowed this." But Queen Victoria was dead, and the old world was dying with her. What followed in the last days of July 1914 was a tragic farce of communication. Wilhelm, terrified of the war he had helped provoke, tried to stop it using the only tool he had left, his family connections. He began sending frantic telegrams to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. These are known as the Willie-Nicky telegrams. They read like letters between two frightened men trying to hold back a tsunami with their bare hands. "Dearest Nicky," Wilhelm wrote, "I am exerting my utmost influence to induce the Austrians to deal straightly, to arrive at a satisfactory understanding with you." "Dearest Willie," Nicholas replied, "I foresee that I will succumb to the pressure that is being brought upon me, and that I will be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war." They were signing the telegrams with their family nicknames while their armies loaded the cannons. On July 31st, the news hit Berlin. Russia had ordered general mobilization. Now the German war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, kicked in. This was a rigid clockwork plan. It stated that if Russia mobilized, Germany had to attack France immediately. Why? Because Germany couldn't fight a two-front war. They had to knock out France in 6 weeks before the massive Russian steamroller could hit them from the east. The plan required invading neutral Belgium to get to Paris. It was a suicide pact with logic. On August 1st, Wilhelm made one last desperate attempt to save his throne from the abyss. A telegram arrived from London suggesting that maybe, just maybe, Britain and France would stay neutral if Germany only attacked Russia. It was a misunderstanding, a false hope, but Wilhelm grabbed it like a drowning man. He summoned his chief of staff, Helmuth von Moltke. The scene that followed is one of the most pivotal moments in the 20th century. Wilhelm, flushed with excitement, told Moltke, "We have a chance. We just march east. We leave France alone. We throw the whole army against Russia." Moltke, a gloomy, high-strung man, looked at the Kaiser in horror. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice trembling, "that is impossible." "Why?" demanded the Kaiser. "I am the supreme warlord. I order it." Moltke explained with tears in his eyes that the mobilization was a machine. There were 11,000 trains moving. Millions of men were walking to specific depots. The timetables had been calculated to the minute. You cannot turn 11,000 trains around. If they changed the order now, the German army wouldn't be an army. It would be a chaotic mob of starving men stuck at train stations. The deployment of millions cannot be improvised, Moltke said. Wilhelm looked at his general. He realized in that terrified second that his title was a lie. He wasn't the supreme warlord. He was a passenger. The machine he had built, the pride of Prussia, the greatest army in the world, was running itself. It didn't care about his cousins. It didn't care about his telegrams. It only cared about the timetable. Wilhelm stared at Moltke and said bitterly, "Your uncle would have given me a different answer." But he signed the order. War was declared. For a brief shining moment, the fear evaporated and was replaced by euphoria. On August 4th, Wilhelm stood on the balcony of the Royal Palace in Berlin. Below him, a sea of people, hundreds of thousands of Germans, cheered wildly. They threw hats in the air. They sang patriotic songs. Wilhelm, caught up in the emotion, shouted his most famous line, "I know no parties anymore. I know only Germans." He wept. The crowd wept. For the first time in his life, he felt truly loved. The insecurities, the withered arm, the years of ridicule, it all vanished in the roar of the crowd. He was the father of the nation. The country was united behind him. The socialists, the liberals, the conservatives, they all rallied to the flag. He thought it would be a glorious parade. He told his departing troops, "You will be home before the leaves fall." He truly believed it. He thought he would ride a white horse into Paris, dictate a peace treaty, and return to Berlin as the greatest Hohenzollern of them all. He moved his headquarters to the city of Koblenz, then to Luxembourg, to be close to the front. He wanted to watch the victory, but the leaves fell, and the soldiers did not come home. Instead, the reality of industrial warfare smashed the romantic illusions of the Kaiser. The German army marched through Belgium, committing atrocities that horrified the world, burning libraries, shooting civilians. The Hun image was cemented. Britain declared war. The British Expeditionary Force landed in France. In September 1914, the German advance was stopped at the River Marne. The Schlieffen Plan failed. The war of movement ended. The trenches were dug. The machine guns were set up. When the news of the retreat at the Marne reached headquarters, General Moltke had a nervous breakdown. He was found sobbing. The Kaiser was bewildered. "But we are invincible," he stammered. He wasn't invincible. He was irrelevant. As the war bogged down into the mud and blood of the trenches, the supreme warlord found himself increasingly irrelevant, a ghost haunting his own headquarters. But power abhors a vacuum. As Wilhelm faded into the background, pinning medals and playing cards to hide from the horror, two new figures emerged from the smoke of the Eastern Front, men made of iron who would turn the Kaiser's war into a machine that would consume them all. By 1916, the German Empire had effectively ceased to be a monarchy. It had become a military dictatorship hidden behind a velvet curtain, and the man on the throne was no longer the ruler. He was the mascot. The transformation was complete with the rise of the Third Supreme Command. Two men now held the fate of Germany in their hands, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his quartermaster, General Erich Ludendorff. They were a formidable pair. Hindenburg was the idol, a towering block of a man, calm, slow-moving, the hero of the Eastern Front, whom the German people worshipped like a wooden god. Ludendorff was the brain, a manic, obsessive genius with bulging eyes and a fragile temper, who worked 18 hours a day and viewed the war as a mathematical problem to be solved with human lives. Wilhelm II was terrified of them. He called them the twins. He hated Ludendorff's rudeness and envied Hindenburg's popularity, but he could not fire them. They were the only things keeping the war effort together, and so the Kaiser was reduced to a rubber stamp. When he visited headquarters, the generals would stop talking about strategy and switch to polite small talk until he left. They managed him like a difficult child. But in early 1917, they placed a document on his desk that would seal his doom. It was the order for unrestricted submarine warfare. The generals argued that if German U-boats were allowed to sink any ship approaching Britain, even neutral American merchant ships, they could starve England into surrender within 6 months. It was a cold, calculated gamble. Wilhelm hesitated. He was not a fool. He knew what this meant. If we do this, he argued, America will declare war. We cannot fight the whole world. He remembered the vast resources of the United States. He remembered his friends in America. He had a moment of clarity where he saw the cliff edge. But Hindenburg and Ludendorff were relentless. They pounded the table. They promised him, guaranteed him, that not a single American soldier will land on the continent before Britain surrendered. They told the Kaiser that if he didn't sign, he was a coward. Wilhelm looked at the faces of his generals. He looked at his own withered arm, the symbol of his lifelong weakness. He couldn't bear to be called a coward. He took the pen and signed the order. "I am bringing about the ruin of the world," he reportedly whispered to a friend. He was right. The U-boats were unleashed. They sank American ships. And in April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The giant had been awoken. The clock began to tick. Germany now had to win the war before the Americans arrived in force. While the Kaiser signed death warrants in comfortable chateaus, his people were beginning to starve. The British naval blockade, the iron ring around Germany, was strangling the country. The winter of 1916 to 1917 became known as the Steckrübe winter, the turnip winter. The potato crop had failed. There was no meat, no butter, no fats. The German people, a proud and industrious nation, were reduced to eating turnips, fodder usually reserved for pigs. They made bread out of sawdust and potato peels. In Berlin, women stood in freezing lines for hours to get a handful of coal. Children were dying of rickets and tuberculosis. And where was the Kaiser? He was traveling on his royal train, the Ammerungen. The train was a rolling palace, stocked with white bread, champagne, and fresh meats. When the Kaiser visited cities, the police cleared the streets so he wouldn't see the angry faces of the women in the food queues. He lived in a bubble of denial. He honestly believed his people were suffering gladly for him. He would hand out iron crosses to soldiers who were half-starved, telling them to fight on for God and King. But the soldiers were starting to ask, why are we eating rat stew while the officers drink wine? Why is the Kaiser's table full while our children starve? The mystical bond between the Hohenzollerns and the people was snapping. The father figure had become a parasite. Then a tremor shook the ground from the east. In March 1917, the unimaginable happened. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, Wilhelm's cousin Nicky, was forced to abdicate. The Russian Revolution was a thunderclap. For centuries, the Romanovs had ruled with absolute power. Now the Tsar was a prisoner in his own palace, and the red flag was flying over St. Petersburg. Wilhelm was shaken, but he drew the wrong conclusion. He didn't see it as a warning of what happens to autocrats who lose touch with their people. He saw it as a military opportunity. With the Tsar gone, Russia might collapse. In a move of cynical brilliance that would backfire spectacularly, The German High Command decided to transport a radical Marxist agitator named Vladimir Lenin from exile in Switzerland back to Russia. They put Lenin in a sealed train, like a biological weapon in a test tube, and shipped him across Germany to infection point in St. Petersburg. Wilhelm signed off on this too. He helped destroy a fellow monarchy to win a temporary military advantage. He didn't realize he was exporting a virus that would eventually come back to infect Germany. Lenin succeeded. Russia collapsed. The Eastern Front ended. Suddenly, in early 1918, it looked like Germany might actually win. With Russia out of the war, millions of German soldiers were freed up. Hindenburg and Ludendorff moved them all to the west for one final, massive roll of the dice. The spring offensive of 1918. They called it the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. It was a cruel name because the Kaiser had nothing to do with it. He was merely the spectator invited to watch the show. On March 21, 1918, the offensive began. It was the greatest artillery barrage in history. The German stormtroopers smashed through the British and French lines. For the first time in 4 years, the stalemate was broken. The Germans were advancing. They were marching on Paris. Wilhelm was ecstatic. He rushed to the front, handing out medals, posing for photos. He declared a national holiday. "The battle is won," he shouted. He thought he had done it. He thought he had saved his throne. But the offensive was a mirage. The German army was exhausted. They were advancing, but they had no trucks, no tanks, and no food. When the starving German soldiers overran the Allied trenches and found them stocked with corned beef, white bread, and wine, they stopped fighting and started eating. They realized then that the enemy was not starving. The enemy was rich. The enemy was unbeatable. The offensive stalled. The Americans began to arrive, not just a few, but hundreds of thousands a month, fresh, well-fed, and eager. On August the 8th, 1918, the hammer fell. The Allies launched a massive counterattack at Amiens, led by hundreds of tanks. The exhausted German lines shattered. Whole divisions surrendered without firing a shot. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German Army. At headquarters, panic set in. Ludendorff had a nervous breakdown, foaming at the mouth and shouting at his staff. But the Kaiser refused to believe it. He retreated into a fantasy world. He talked about holding the line. He talked about a miracle weapon. He talked about King Frederick the Great, who had been saved at the last moment. In September, the generals finally went to the Kaiser at the Hotel Britannique in Spa, Belgium. They had to tell him the truth. The war was lost. The army was on the verge of total collapse. They needed an armistice immediately. Wilhelm stared at them. "But we are deep in enemy territory," he stammered. "We cannot be losing." They told him there was no choice. And then they dropped the second bombshell. The American President Woodrow Wilson had replied to the German peace feelers. Wilson was clear. The United States would not negotiate with a military dictator or an autocrat. If Germany wanted peace, the Kaiser had to be sidelined. Wilhelm was furious. "I will not leave," he shouted. "I am the King of Prussia by the grace of God." He decided to make one last stand. He would institute reforms. He would create a parliamentary government. He appointed a liberal, Prince Max of Baden, as chancellor. He tried to become a people's emperor overnight. He thought that if he gave the people a vote, they would let him keep his crown. But he was years too late. The German people were no longer listening to speeches. They were listening to their empty stomachs. And they were listening to the whispers coming from the naval ports. The final tragedy began not in the trenches, but in the place Wilhelm loved most, his navy. In late October 1918, the German admirals, acting on their own initiative, decided to launch a suicide mission. They ordered the High Seas Fleet to steam out and attack the British Royal Navy in a death ride. They wanted to go down fighting, to save the honor of the officer corps. It was madness. The war was already lost. The sailors knew that sailing out meant certain death for no reason other than the vanity of their admirals. On October 29th, in the port of Wilhelmshaven in Kiel, the order was given to raise steam. The sailors refused. They put out the boiler fires. They arrested their officers. This was the nightmare Wilhelm had never foreseen. He had always feared the socialists. He had feared the French. He had feared the Russians. But he had never, ever feared his own sailors. These were his darlings. He had designed their uniforms. He had christened their ships. And now they were mutinying. The red flags went up the masts of the battleships Thüringen and Helgoland. The mutiny spread like wildfire. It moved from the ships to the docks and from the docks to the cities. Workers' and soldiers' councils, modeled on the Russian Soviets, began to take over power stations, train stations, and police headquarters. The revolution had arrived, and it wasn't charging across the border. It was rising up from the very heart of the German Empire. Wilhelm sat in his headquarters in Spa, staring at the map. The red pins of the revolution were moving closer. Munich fell. Hamburg fell. Berlin was teetering. He had one card left to play, or so he thought. He called his generals together. "I will lead the army back to Germany," he declared, his eyes wild. "We will crush the revolution. I will shoot the rebels in the streets." He looked at his generals, expecting them to click their heels and draw their swords. He looked at Hindenburg. He looked at Groener, the new second in command. General Groener looked at the Kaiser, the supreme warlord, the all-highest, and delivered the sentence that ended 500 years of Hohenzollern rule. "Sire," Groener said quietly, "the army will march home in peace and order under its commanding generals, but it will not march under your majesty. The army no longer stands behind you." Wilhelm turned to Hindenburg, looking for support. "But I have their oath," he cried. "They swore an oath to me on the flag." Groener replied with the cold, hard realism of the 20th century. "Sire, in times like these, oaths are just words." The illusion of absolute power shattered in that instant. The army, his army, was gone. On November 9th, 1918, while Wilhelm still hallucinated about rallying loyal troops, Berlin moved on without him. On November 9th, 1918, in the gray, drizzling town of Spa, Belgium, the fate of the German Empire was sealed not by the Kaiser, but by a press release from Berlin. While Wilhelm II still hallucinated about leading loyal troops back to crush the revolution, Chancellor Prince Max of Baden unilaterally announced his abdication to save the capital from communism. Stripped of power and abandoned by the very generals who had sworn oaths to him, Wilhelm was forced to accept the brutal truth. He had lost both his crown and his country. In the pre-dawn darkness of November 10th, the former supreme warlord fled to the Netherlands, enduring the humiliation of waiting at the border like a refugee before Queen Wilhelmina granted him asylum, officially ending 5 centuries of Hohenzollern rule. The early years of exile were a purgatory of uncertainty, marked by the fear of Allied prosecution and the pathetic attempt to maintain a miniature court at Hoosdorn. Wilhelm grew a beard to mask the face that was once the ultimate symbol of power, but personal tragedy soon shattered his spirit. The suicide of his youngest son Joachim and the subsequent death of his heartbroken wife Donna left him utterly desolate. In his isolation, the former emperor found solace in a strange obsession: chopping wood. He personally felled tens of thousands of trees, each blow of the axe serving as a violent outlet for his rage against a world that had rejected him. The 1930s brought a final, fatal delusion. Encouraged by his second wife, Hermine, Wilhelm believed the rise of the Nazi Party was the prelude to a monarchist restoration. He courted Nazi leaders and even provided financial support, failing to realize that Hitler viewed him merely as an old idiot. When Hitler consolidated total power and ignored the Kaiser, the bitterness returned. Yet, despite his conservative prejudices, Wilhelm was genuinely repulsed by the state-sponsored violence of Kristallnacht in 1938, confessing for the first time that he was ashamed to be German. When World War II erupted and German troops invaded the Netherlands in 1940, Wilhelm refused Winston Churchill's offer of asylum in Britain, choosing instead to die in exile under the watch of a Germany he no longer recognized. He spent his final days guarded by German soldiers, men who now wore the swastika instead of the imperial crest. In a desperate and regrettable attempt to claim a slice of glory when Paris fell, he sent a congratulatory telegram to Hitler, only to be met with silence. Wilhelm II died in June 1941 at the age of 82 and was buried quietly in Dorn, leaving strict instructions that his body should not return to Germany until the country was free again. When Paris fell to the Nazis in 1940, Wilhelm sent a telegram congratulating Hitler, a desperate, pathetic attempt to be relevant one last time. But privately, he was horrified by the brutality of the new regime. For the first time, he whispered, "I am ashamed to be a German." He died in June 1941